Do you consider yourself to be on the left or the right or neither? Or
Well, here's how I think about it, right? My interest is in our society thriving, our culture thriving, our culture doing better. And I don't think the right or the left is always right. It's contextual, right? There are times when you want higher taxes and more government spending. There are times when you want lower taxes and less government spending. There are times when you need more immigration. You know, after World War II, Britain, Australia, Canada, many countries wanted more immigrants to come because they needed to rebuild their society. There are times when you need less immigration. And so I think it's about where you are in the moment as opposed to these rigid ideological positions like, you know, I am pro-immigration or I'm anti-immigration. I think both of those are pretty misguided positions. What you want is to be in the right place at the right time. So I don't know if you've noticed this, but it seems to me like political labeling is now mostly a weapon that people use against
100%.
their opponents, right? Like, if I don't agree with you, it's convenient for me to label you as a member of the opposite tribe. So if I'm on the right, well, you're a communist. If I'm on the left, well, you're far right. And this is how we have conversations now. I have some positions that are currently considered right-wing. I have some positions that are currently considered left-wing. And, you know, one of the things I really learned from my history and my family's history, and I talk about this in the book, as you know, is that ideology is a very bad thing always. And so the moment you buy into a prepackaged set of ideas about what you're supposed to believe, you very quickly find yourself having to believe things that you don't actually agree with so that you get to stay in the tribe. Mm-hmm. I don't care about the tribe. I care about the truth.
There's a quote you referenced, which I actually sent to my friends earlier on, and I was talking to them. It is, I have no interest whatsoever in the false dichotomy of right versus left. If there is one thing my Soviet childhood taught me, it's that subscribing to someone else's ideology will always inevitably mean having to suspend your own judgment about right and wrong to appease your tribe, which is on chapter 1 of your book, on page 21. And it really, you know, as a podcaster, when you really want, you're genuinely curious and you want to interview lots of people from lots of backgrounds, the great thing about doing this job is I have to teach myself to always look at the other side. So if you represent one side, my job in many respects is to try and understand the other side so we can talk about the other side as well, to like represent the other side. And that's been really useful for me because it's stopped me falling into the trap of like conforming with a tribe. And also, as you say, like when you talk about the right and left thing being a label and a weapon that people will use, it's the same. When a journalist wants to write about me, what they'll do is they'll find the most right-wing person that's ever been on my podcast and they'll say, he interviews people like insert name, insert name.
Yeah.
As if to say, I am those two people.
Yes. Or in our case with TRIGGERnometry, what happens is we are people who started our show because we were pushing back against the woke progressive dogma in our comedy industry at the time. And so a lot of our early guests were exploring perspectives that were not ours. We were two Remain voters. And when the Brexit vote happened, we were really confused because we were part of that kind of elitist, metropolitan, you know, I don't know anyone who voted Brexit kind of thing. But my perspective was, I found it odd that people were saying, well, you know, the reason people voted for Brexit is because half the country is racist. And I was like, I mean, come on. That's just factually incorrect. We both know that. That's not to say that bigoted people don't exist, and that doesn't mean that some Brexit voters weren't racist. But to explain a complex phenomenon like that by a simplistic explanation of that just wasn't accurate. So we had a lot of people who were pro-Brexit on the show to understand where they're coming from. Well, one of the things that happens is if you talk to a lot of people from one side, then the people from the other side say what you just said. Well, he's talked to this, this, and this. I won't go on his show. Right?
Yeah.
And then they use that against you to say, well, you only talk to these people. And like, I'm like, we've invited your Owen Joneses and your Ash Sarkars and all the others, and Ash should come on soon. And we've had lots of people from different perspectives. But if I'm writing an article about you or if I want to tweet something about you, it's very easy to use.
What is wokeism as far as you see it? Because the word kind of sounds like a compliment.
It was initially. It was a self-compliment initially. So wokeness came along really in around 2014, and if you're interested, we can talk about why it does around that time, because it's a very interesting thing that I actually think speaks to the moment we're in more broadly. But it was initially used by people, particularly kind of Black Lives Matter and racial activists in America, about themselves. And what they were saying is, we are awakened to certain realizations like what they call intersectionality, which is the idea that, different racial and sexual and other groups in society are treated differently. And we're now awake to this. That's what wokeness meant. And now we are aware of these systemic forces that are disadvantaging certain groups. And now we're going to pursue activism that's designed to address, white privilege, male privilege, and all of this other stuff. But very quickly what happened is a lot of people looked at some of the ways these people were behaving and other people around them were behaving and started making fun of it, which is what often happens. And so now the word woke is kind of an insult that's being used to say these people are somewhat detached from reality and they're obsessed about trivial issues that don't actually have much bearing on reality. They're not interested in facts, they're interested in narratives and so on. But if you're asking me what woke culture really is, it's a combination of things. First and foremost, it's the promotion and celebration of victimhood. First and foremost. Then you take that victimhood and you say different groups are differently victimized. Some groups are victimized, so Black people, ethnic minorities, women. And by the way, of course, there's a kernel of truth to all these things, right? Certain groups are disadvantaged in society, or perhaps a better way of saying is, generally speaking, have worse outcomes than others. And that, we can explore why that is in more detail. But what we then do is we build a hierarchy of oppression. Some groups are more oppressed than others, which makes them better, morally superior to others. And there are some other groups that are suspect because they're doing better. So this ideology kind of says the way to work out who is oppressed and who is the oppressor, because if you have the oppressed, you have to have someone who's oppressing them. We can't say, different groups do different in society for all sorts of different reasons. If someone is not doing as well as someone else, that's because they've been oppressed, right? And then you work out this hierarchy, white people are the evil at the top. You throw in some other successful minorities. For example, in the UK and in America, Asians from the Far East, Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, they do very well. Right? So they are now seen as part of the kind of the oppressor groups. That's why in American colleges, for example, they're discriminated against in admissions because they do better than Hispanics and Blacks, right? So it's essentially a way of creating a very, very simplistic and frankly ridiculous way of looking at people, not as individuals, Stephen, Konstantin, but as groups, Black, white, Russian, Jewish, whatever way you want to look at it. And it's this generalized thing. And one of the reasons it's so destructive is it's asking all the wrong questions. It's asking the question of why are people struggling, right? But it doesn't ask it from the right perspective. The real, poverty is the norm. The real question is what creates prosperity? What creates success? What creates successful outcomes for different groups? And if you just focus on, what happened to a certain group 200 years ago, you're really not going to get to the answer of how to uplift people in the present moment. So it's the elevation of victimhood. It's obsession about racial and sexual and gender dynamics. And it's the promotion of a kind of anti-Western, anti-white, anti-male ideology that I believe is very, very dangerous to actually the very great societies that we've created, which are based on the idea that, I have some issues with multiculturalism, but a multiracial society I think is a very healthy thing, provided we are not encouraged to see each other as members of separate and divided tribes. But that is exactly what this ideology does.
What is the harm of victimhood? And how is that like really showing up in people's everyday lives from an individual standpoint? And so I really want to know like how victimhood is becoming self-harm. So if I choose to adopt a victimhood mindset, how does that hurt me, Stephen?
Well, there's 100 different ways, but one of the things we know from psychology is what they call perception is projection. I don't know if you're familiar with this idea. Okay, you've had Jordan Peterson on the show, right? So one of the things he talks about is you cannot see unless you have a hierarchy of value in your mind, right? There is an almost unlimited number of things I could be looking at in this room. There's a bunch of books behind you. There's cameras in the room. Your producer's over there. There's a wall. There's lights. There's all kinds of things. But I'm looking at you. Why? Because in this moment, you're the most important thing that's happening to me in this room, right? Our conversation. However, if I walk into this room and I am triggered by books, right? I wouldn't be able to focus on you. I would only be able to focus on what's behind you, right? Now, let's say you walk around thinking that because of your racial background, everyone's out to get you. Well, what are you going to see out in the world? You're going to see people look at you funny. Now, people look at you funny for all sorts of different reasons. People look at me funny. People look at women funny. People look at men funny for all sorts of different reasons. You might walk past a police officer and you might think, well, I know that my racial background makes me a victim of police brutality. Therefore, I'm going to be on edge. What does that mean? Well, if a police officer says something to you, you might interpret it differently than you might have done as if you were just a normal guy, right? And on it goes. So you bring your perceptual filters into every situation. And therefore, the outcomes that you experience are predetermined to a very significant part, not by the other people, but by your own expectations. And so when you teach people to be victims, you make them victims. You actually cause them to suffer in real life. And the people who need to be resilient and strong and to be taught that you may be mistreated sometimes by different people, but you have the capacity to overcome that. You have the capacity to make that. You can be whoever you want. You live in a free society where no one can stop you. The people who need that message the most are the people who are actually victims, the people who actually suffer discrimination, the people who actually come from difficult backgrounds. They need that message more than anyone.
It reminded me of that video I saw you do, or feature in, where you talk about the scar experiment, which made it very real. For anyone that hasn't seen that video, what was that experiment?
Basically what they did is they took a bunch of people, I think it was mostly women, some men, and they said to them, what we're doing today, so they set the frame, what we're doing today is we are doing an experiment to find out how people with facial disfigurements are treated in society. And they put scarring on their face in front of a mirror so they could see that they had some really serious facial disfigurements. And as they were leaving the room, they said, you know what, we just need to touch that scar up a little bit more. And they removed the scarring. So these people went into what was set up as a job interview, thinking they had scars on their face, but the scarring had been removed without their knowledge. And when they walked into those interviews, when they came out, they were asked a bunch of questions. And what people found was they had massively increased levels of discrimination for their facial disfigurements. They reported specific comments that the interviewers had made about their face, even though they had no scarring at all. They brought their expectation in with them, and they came out with the result that they were looking for.
So they believed they were discriminated against?
Yeah.